Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Lageson, Executive Secretary for the Committee on the Present Danger China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help being provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable content. Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is the Executive Chairman for the Center for Security Policy, Vice Chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China, and host of Securing America with Frank Gaffney on Real America's Voice Network.
Thank you, Dee Dee. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Committee on the Present Danger China's ongoing webinar series about the Chinese Communist Party's threat to the United States. Prominently, we feature its unrestricted warfare techniques, which amount to a comprehensive array of efforts that have been underway for decades, aimed at taking down our country without firing a shot. Today, we're going to address a somewhat different but very much related topic, the prospect that the Chinese Communist Party may now be turning to fighting the United States, including by firing at us, certainly at our allies, and most notably, the island of Taiwan. We're very pleased to have with us to talk about a new report that sheds light on how that might be done by the Chinese Communist Party and to what effect. That has just been released by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's entitled The First Battle of the Next War, a U.S.-China conflict over Taiwan. Its authors, led by Colonel Mark Cancian, include his son, Matthew Cancian, a PhD who is a veteran of the Marine Corps, as is his father, and now involved in wargaming at the Naval War College, and Eric Higginbotham, a man who has fluency in both Japanese and Chinese and has been studying closely the Chinese communists, among other things, in connection with the 24 scenarios that were wargamed by the CSIS team. Its three lead investigators, ably represented with us today, I'm pleased to say, by Colonel Cancian. He has a number of distinctions to his credit, having served both in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, of course, in the Marine Corps in uniform, as well as at the Office of Management and Budget. He has written prolifically on these and related issues, and we're very pleased to have him with us to present, to inform our conversation and to respond to questions about his report and otherwise engage with other distinguished members of this panel, all of whom happen to be members as well of our Committee on the Present Danger China, and I will introduce them in turn. Before I do that, let me welcome to the podium, virtual podium that it is, Colonel Cancian. Thank you so much for joining us, sir, and for your contributions to illuminating one of the most important issues of our time, whether a war is coming and whether it will be restricted to an invasion of Taiwan, and either way, how it might come out. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Yes, let me tell you a little about our project. We ran a 15-month project funded by the Smith Richardson Foundation that looked at two questions. One is, could the Chinese invade Taiwan successfully, and what might be the outcome of such an invasion? In doing that, we don't argue that this is the most probable future course of action, but we do argue that it is a possible future course of action given the rhetoric of the Chinese government, and it is certainly the most dangerous, and for that reason, it was important to investigate. It's interesting to note that this question about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan and a conflict in the Western Pacific, which was once considered not very relevant for serious discussion, is now a frequent topic of discussion among experts in the area. What we did is we created a war game. It consisted of 2 maps. Is a 5-foot by 6-foot map for the operational space in the Western Pacific, and then there's a smaller map for the ground war in Taiwan. We developed some 2,500 counters. The game turns were 3.5 days each. The project is, I think, important for 3 reasons, other than the fact that it looks at an important public policy issue. One is it was done entirely with unclassified material. So we can talk about it openly, we can examine the assumptions, we can be specific about the outcomes, and transparent about all of the scenarios. Of course, DoD does a lot of classified wargaming, but that's all behind closed doors. Little bits and pieces leak out. Very often they're not very helpful. The second thing is we ran 24 iterations, as you heard, in a variety of scenarios, and we did that to develop a strong analytical foundation for making recommendations. Many war games have been conducted that are run once or twice. They can be very interesting, particularly for the people involved, but that's not a strong analytic foundation. You only have one strategy, one scenario, one set of players. We wanted to have a broad set of iterations so we get a lot of different approaches. And the third thing is we spent a lot of time on the front end developing the game, not just analyzing forces, but also assessing combat results so that we develop tables and computer programs to assess what happens when the forces came in contact. It wasn't a case of someone going in the back room and making their personal judgment about what the outcome might be. It also meant that the first iteration was adjudicated the same way as the 24th, so it was entirely consistent. I do want to emphasize that first, of course, we are not predicting that such a conflict will happen, only that it is possible. And we're not making recommendations about what overall U.S. policy towards Taiwan should be. That's a much broader question. We're looking at the military operational issues. And let me give you a little sense about some of the things that we found. I think you all have the link to the report itself. There's also like a 2.5 minute video that gives you a quick overview. The first thing I want to emphasize is that the Ukraine strategy won't work. In other words, for Ukraine, when the war began, we shipped large amounts of equipment and munitions to Ukraine to beef them up. We're continuing that. The Russians have tried to interdict that flow, but have not been successful. That won't work with Taiwan. The Chinese defensive bubble over Taiwan is so strong, you can't get anything onto the island once the shooting begins. In several of the game iterations, participants tried to do that. They lost an entire squadron of C-17s one time. They lost an entire amphibious readiness group one time. You can't get anything onto the island. What that means is that Taiwan is going to fight the war with whatever it starts the war with. That means that FMS is very important. Speeding that process up is critically important. And perhaps getting weapons and munitions to Taiwan in other ways would also be useful. There's been talk, for example, of U.S. prepositioning stocks on Taiwan. And I think that would actually be very sensible. Another insight was that 90% of U.S. air losses were on the ground to Chinese missiles, not in the air. And the reason is the Chinese have a lot of missiles. They fire them at U.S. bases. And as a result, the U.S. and Japan and Taiwan lose most of their aircraft on the ground. What that means is that it's really important to do 2 things. One is to disperse and auxiliary airfields, and particularly in Japan, using commercial airports, international airports, building the facilities there so they can be used for dispersal airfields and hardening shelters. The United States stopped doing that at the end of the Cold War. The Japanese have a few. There are a few at Misawa, for example, or I think there are a few at Kadena. We need lots more. There are none on Guam. We've got this enormous airfield. We're going to use it extensively. No hardened shelters. U.S. Aircraft are destroyed literally by the hundreds. Japan is critically important to making this fight. If we don't have access to the bases in Japan, particularly Kadena, Misawa, we have to try to fight from Guam. Guam gets hammered by missiles, so then that pushes you back to Alaska, Hawaii, Australia, very far away. It can be done with bombers, very, very difficult though. That connection with Japan, absolutely critical. We could talk about bombers. The combination of bombers and long-range anti-ship missiles was very powerful. A bomber squadron can launch something like 160 of these, and they were devastating to the Chinese fleet. The problem is we don't have very many. The long-range anti-ship missiles, the one that we use primarily is called LRASM. In 2026, we'll have 400. By contrast, we'll have about 7,500 land attack missiles. Critically short on these missiles, and they are, if you had to pick one thing to buy, that would be the thing. We also recommend keeping the bombers in the force. The Air Force is inclined to retire the B-52s and the B-1s, figuring that the B-21s will come on board at one point. We say no, keep all of the bombers, and then add B-21s on top of that because they're just so useful, because you can base them outside of the Chinese defensive ring. There's surface ships. Surface ships very vulnerable to Chinese missiles. At the beginning of the war, the Chinese go after the U.S. carriers. Typically, they sink the two carriers in the Western Pacific. U.S. and Japan lose 10 to 20 surface combatants, and the reason is the difficulty with these Chinese missiles. U.S. has excellent defensive capabilities, but they can be overwhelmed by the number of Chinese missiles, both ground-launched and air-launched. By contrast, submarines are hugely helpful. Getting those into the Taiwan Straits, they really wreak havoc on the Chinese amphibious fleet. We call it the happy time for U.S. submarines. Some of you may catch the reference to World War II. The problem is that, of course, we don't have enough. The submarines get into the strait, they expend all their munitions, their torpedoes, their missiles, and then they have to go back to Japan or Guam to reload. So, they're on this conveyor belt, but they lose some time there. It would be great to build more submarines, difficult with an industrial base, but our recommendation is the United States should at least make sure it funds the two attack submarines that it can build in a typical year. And the last point I want to make is about culture and losses. The United States suffers greater losses in the game lasted typically 3-4 weeks. For instance, we lose something like 3,500, 4,000 killed. That's about half as many as we lost in 20 years of conflict in the Middle East. Two carriers sunk hundreds and hundreds of aircraft, and this is going to be a difficult cultural change for the services, particularly the Air Force and the Navy, because they've operated in sanctuary for essentially 70 years. The analog or the illustration I make is that Air Force squadrons, reinforcing squadrons, are going to land at Kadena on Okinawa. They're going to land on a runway that's bumpy because it's been repaired so many times because it was hit by Chinese missiles. They're going to taxi past literally hundreds of wrecked aircraft that have been bulldozed to the side of the runway because they were destroyed, again, by the Chinese missiles. They're going to move into a barracks that was occupied by another squadron, but that was wiped out in the last week. And the golf course has been turned into a cemetery because of the high casualties. The United States has not been accustomed to living or fighting in that kind of environment, not since the Second World War. It's going to take a cultural change. I think the leadership understands it. You listen to them, they talk about it, they get it, I think, but making the cultural change all the way down, that's going to be a challenge.
Mark, thank you very much. I think one of the things that should have been said at the outset by me probably is you ran these 24 exercises, simulations, war games, and I think as you put it in the report, China mostly lost. And one of the things I think we'll want to tease out with you is, how many times is mostly, and what happened when they didn't lose, and how has that netted out as you see it in terms of the lessons learned. Do you want to take just a quick
let me jump in there, because you're absolutely right. I mean, and I skipped over that on my notes, and I really should not have done that. The bottom line is that in almost all the scenarios, Taiwan can endure as a democratic and independent entity, but the cost is very high. You heard about some of those costs. Cost the United States to Taiwan, whose economy gets wrecked. Cost to Japan gets pulled into this conflict, but also cost to the Chinese. They lose dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft themselves, enough, and potentially thousands and thousands of POWs on Taiwan, perhaps enough to destabilize the Chinese Communist Party. So there are losses all around, and our recommendations are aimed at improving deterrence so we never have to fight this war.
Right. That's a point on which I know we will return with our commentators as well as with you. Thank you very much, Mark, both for the work that you've just described and for the excellent description of it. We're going to turn first to Captain James Fennell, no stranger to these programs or to others who follow the work of the Committee on the Present Danger China. Jim, formerly in uniform, served as the Chief of Intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the culmination of a very distinguished decades-long career in the United States Navy. He has gone on to continue the fight, notably by helping disseminate information about China, notably, not exclusively, what the Chinese are propagandizing about and the implications of it through a group he calls Fennell's Red Storm Risen. He is also a senior fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. I feel constrained to point out it's not the same as ours in Washington, but we're very happy always to have him with us, especially to provide an informed response to these war games and their conclusions. Jim Fennell, thank you for joining us.
Well, good evening, Frank and Mark. Just let me say that as somebody who's been engaged with this at Pacific Fleet, the 7th Fleet, on the board of the USS Kitty Hawk with CTF-70 and the Office of Naval Intelligence, I have been waiting for a long time to have an unclassified assessment of kinetic warfare that analyzes the issue of the PLA and the PRC invading Taiwan. Some of us in uniform, many of us, not some, many of us in the Pacific have been working on this for decades, but we haven't been able to talk about it too much. So I applaud you and your team and CSIS for actually, taking the 15 months to put this together. And I'm not an operations research guy, so I'm not going to be able to comment on Compton's analytic wargaming model and all of the stuff that you describe in your 165 pages. I'm more of a knuckle dragon fleet guy that looked at the Chinese Navy and the Chinese military on a daily basis. And so I agree with most of the assessments. In fact, I agree with all of the assessments that you've made in the study in terms of the conditions. And you say in the study that China will be unlikely to succeed if the following 4 conditions are met. I'll go back to the unlikely part, but on the conditions, I agree. Taiwan must vigorously resist the PRC, and it is something that it needs to begin now. The U.S. must join within days, if not hours, of something like this happening, and it can't be a half-assed assessment or they can't be half-assed in doing it. We must have access to these foreign bases. You mentioned Japan. I think that we'd also should be talking about the Philippines, Australia. I think we can talk about coordination with India from a different vector. I think we can also talk about different places in Oceania. We have our compact states, so Palau is another one that comes to mind, Tinian. And then last thing you talk about is we must have enough air-launched, long-range anti-ship cruise missiles. And that's something that I've been especially vocal about in many, many forums. The only thing I would suggest that you add into this is that it should be supersonic. We have most of the munitions in the U.S. inventory today, and by 2026 will be predominantly subsonic. And at the predominantly subsonic speeds, I think your model breaks down a bit, because as what I saw in the model, it said on pages 30 and 31 that the defenders would have a 70% chance to hit an enemy incoming anti-ship cruise missile. And I think if it's in the subsonic, I think that's not really accurate. I think if it's subsonic, that's accurate. But most of the Chinese missiles are supersonic. And you gave a glancing reference in the study to hypersonics. You called it a niche, not you personally, but the study called it a niche. I think for the United States, that's certainly true. I think for China, by 2026, hypersonic missiles are moving out of niche and into mainstream PLA capability. So I worry about that a bit. The other pieces that I would say is, as an intelligence officer, I noticed throughout all the references and the footnotes that seem to be not as much reference. You got an excellent coverage of American doctrine from the Air Force and the Marine Corps and the Navy, and how we operate, and you cover operations research and how models are built. But I noticed that there seemed to be a little bit thin on some references to PRC and PLA doctrine and strategies. There was only one reference in the text, only footnote to Joint Firepower Strike Campaign. There was no references to the Joint Anti-Air Raid Campaign or the Joint Island Landing Campaign, which is part of PRC doctrine. And I know that you had Lonnie Henley or John Culver quoted twice, and Lonnie Henley once, but I know this community pretty well, and there are some people that are a little bit more, as some people have called them, hawkish on the PRC's capabilities, or not promoting them, but are a little more savvy about the capabilities. And so I think there's a tinge of a bit of mirror imaging. One of your points, it says the U.S. must be able to strike the PLA Navy or the PLA Navy from outside the PRC's defensive perimeter. And the defensive perimeter is what the Chinese call the counter-intervention strategy, what we call anti-access area denial. You described it, how this bubble over Taiwan. Well, it actually extends, this bubble by 2026 is going to be out to Guam. And so the idea that we're promoting in the findings, what we're telling this new House committee, what we're telling the Pentagon, what we're telling appropriators on Capitol Hill is we have to develop only systems that will fight or that will release munitions outside the bubble and that can somehow survive and get in and attack the PLA Navy or PLA Air Force to prevent them from making the island landing. And I would say that I used this earlier today in another webcast with Frank. It's like a boxer. We're saying that we're boxing and we're in a boxing match with the PLA, and we've got a 60-inch reach today in 2026, and they've got an 80-inch reach. And we're saying that we're going to still try to find 26 inches. And what I'm saying is I don't think we can find those 26 inches of reach in the next 3 years. And what we need to learn how to do is to get inside and fight inside the Chinese long-range anti-ship cruise missile capabilities, which is going to be really tough, as you well know from your study. So I think that's something that jumped out to me. Let me just see if there's any other, compounding vectors of attack. You alluded to it. I didn't see it really emphasized in the study, which is you're going to have anti-ship cruise missiles coming in from submarines, from surface ships, from aircraft, fighters and bombers, and from the rocket force, all coming in at supersonic ranges from all vectors, different vectors, against the U.S. Navy, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, and against the Taiwan Navy, in addition to anti-ship ballistic missiles, which you referenced, that 2 carriers in your estimation will be taken out, and 20 plus some major combatants between the U.S. and the Japanese, the Kaijo Jeitai. That's good, but I think you mentioned about Kadena and pilots having to see this culture of seeing death and destruction. I think it's really important, not just from a perspective of an airman at an airbase, but it's the idea of in the fight. When you are in the fight and you're defending your carrier strike group or your amphibious expeditionary strike group, or your ship, your individual destroyer or your frigate or your submarine or your bomber, you're going to be taking fires from many, many vectors. And then when you throw in hypersonics, it really compounds it even more. Last point, people's war. I didn't see any reference to, I know you counted what's out there from the Congressional Research Service and published authoritative order of battle experts, but we had a release here in May of a video or of audio from the Guangdong province between the Central Military Commission generals and the Guangdong province political leaders talking about what was required from the Guangdong province in case of having to execute the Taiwan invasion. And Guangdong was required, the CMC told Guangdong leaders, you owe us 64 10,000-ton Ro-Ros, 38 aircraft, 588 train cars, and 19 ports and docks. And that's just one province. So the Chinese in their doctrine talk about people's war. And so I would have expected there would be a little bit more analysis about people's war and what the PRC writ large can bring into an invasion, which is why in my conclusion, I still believe it's highly likely that China would be able to complete an invasion based on a total war concept. But otherwise, as I said at the beginning, this is a fantastic study. It needs to be promoted. You already know this, but the PRC's well aware of it, and it's been talking about it for the last 72 hours in People's Daily, China Daily, Xinhua, and Global Times. So that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Captain. Mark, we're going to give you a chance to respond to all of this. Take notes, please, because you'll get some more comments, obviously, in the meantime. I did want to just add, I didn't have Eric Higginbotham's bio in front of me when I introduced him as one of the principal investigators alongside the Kansian team. He is a principal research scientist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, formerly was with RAND, and while he was there, he was the lead author on a scorecard comparing U.S. and Chinese military. We're very pleased to have him represented so well by Colonel Kansian. We're going to turn next to another Marine Corps colonel. They are valued in this context, especially those who have spent time, as has our next speaker, a lot of time, both in uniform and as a foreign service officer, as well as an executive in the private sector in the Far East. Grant Newsom is his name. Colonel Newsom is a senior fellow of our Center for Security Policy, and as I mentioned earlier, a member of our Committee on the Present Danger China. Colonel, thank you so much. It's the wee hours of the morning where you are. We appreciate you nonetheless being with us, and over to you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Frank, and I'm glad to be here. But also, I would just start off that I appreciate the effort that went into this war game, and also the fact that Mark has come to talk about it. An awful lot of work goes into it. And the one thing you can be sure of when you run a game like this is that everybody's going to be coming out of the woodwork telling you don't know what you're talking about. Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And it takes I'm sure y'all didn't do it for free, but it takes some nerve to do it. Now, it's good that you're getting out to explain it. But that's just not me being nice. I'm serious about that. But I'll do very quickly. What I'd like to do is to just run down the notes that I took as I read the report. And I did go through all 169 pages of it. I hadn't planned to, but I kept going because it was good. I thought it was an excellent report once I saw myself cited on footnote 277. Okay, but that said, but there are some things though that did come to mind, and that as just a reader of it, that I wondered about, and I'll just run down them. They're no particular order other than as it came to mind. The game noted that the government of Taiwan will sort of resist to the maximum extent of its capabilities, and what I would say is that I'm not so sure about that. Perhaps for purposes of the game, you had to do it. But as I say, there's there's a psychological aspect to what's going on in terms of Taiwan's defense, and I say I have some doubts if things go a certain way. The next one, I didn't notice a mention of Taiwan's civilian population and sort of what it's doing during the fight, what it is having done to it. And this, I think, is considerable, is a big deal. 23 million people in and around a war zone. It presents some obstacles, and when they start getting killed in large numbers, it just has to put it mildly, a destabilizing effect. But I didn't see that mentioned so much in the report. Also, the political warfare aspects of a Taiwan scenario. Things China does to Taiwan beforehand, for example, things it does to us. Say that the political, the psychological, the mental aspect of a fight. Once again, I didn't notice it as much as I thought I might. It almost seemed like just to see it, like two hoodlums getting in together behind a Waffle House and fighting it out at 2 a.m. to see who the toughest guy is in Prince William County. To set it up in that sense, a little glib about that, but I didn't see the mental aspects of the fight, which are hard. It's hard to cover, but I didn't notice it. Next point, Chinese fifth columnists in Taiwan. I didn't notice a real mention of that, other than in some of the summations of the scenarios saying saboteurs would make movement difficult, or something like that. But I think this is a huge piece of the equation, is the fifth columnist. And, I would, just as one example, I noticed there's a fight for Kaohsiung, or somehow take Kaohsiung, the port. Some would suggest that organized crime control of Kaohsiung port is such that they just might open it up. But that's a detail. But say the fifth column activity, I think that after 50, 60 years, but getting it all in place, that it may be a serious factor in a fight. I just didn't notice it. I had a feeling that the PLA amphibious capabilities might have been underestimated a little bit, and I would suggest that if it's a one-time fight, one shot where you want to get to Taiwan and take it, that you don't really care how much you lose, whereas we don't want to have that happen to us. I'm sorry, but it just had a feeling that the assessment seemed a little bit like the way we would go about assessing our own capabilities. The question of unambiguous advance notice by D minus 14 could be, but as I say, and you have to set something. It seemed like a reasonable guess, or estimate, though I could imagine it actually coming with D minus 0 if things go a certain way, and use of deception, etc. And we just don't recognize what we're seeing. I thought it was very good that you covered a possibility of using Japan's civilian airfields to get out and about, to disperse. They're grotesquely overbuilt with airfields from the bubble era. They got 100 plus of them, civilian airfields, and probably 90 of these get about 3 flights a day. And also, next point, with these sorts of games, that the one thing that a lot of people will ask is, well, did you talk to so-and-so? Did you talk to him, talk to that? And I did, because in some of the sort of the commentary, and I got the impression you did talk to an awful lot of people. But there were some that there's a certain groupthink in this field, and it takes some effort to get out of that. Just a feeling. Regarding Japan's self-defense force capabilities, I'm probably a little more of a pessimist than most people, but they just noted that it can be a tendency to assume more of the Japanese military than one thinks. The possibility of, and I was wondering as I was reading this, well, what if the U.S. just folds? It decides not to get in. Or what if the Taiwan government folds? And but you all noted that and said, well, look, if that happens, we don't have a war game. And that's so it's fair enough. And that's that was good. I thought did very good job on the ambivalence of America's allies and partners and potential partners. That was good. I also was wondering, did you all, to the extent the fight in the war game is fairly narrowly constrained, and I was wondering to the extent to which, say, how a Russian move in the Baltics in Europe, or the Iranians doing something, or the North Koreans doing something, how did that weigh into the game? When you expand the battlefield, for example, it seems as though our prospects go up, and also the potential deterrent value of being willing to do that as well. I did notice that all the iterations, the variations that were tried, it was good to see this. There's probably any number, you could probably still be doing them if you wanted to. But I thought it was good to try to think through, a lot of options, and that was good. I thought the assessments that were made about things were thoughtful, and they seemed sensible to me. I thought it was good to see that the need to get things organized with the Japanese beforehand, that was pointed out as well. I was wondering also if, as part of our preparation for a scenario, an event, if any thought was given to getting the Taiwan military out of its isolation, bring it out to Guam for training in peacetime. There's talk about putting U.S. forces on Taiwan, but what about, say, for now, getting them out and about and showing them that we actually do give two hoots about it. And the last point was the conclusion, as I read it, was that it really just downplayed the possibility of the PRC being able to meaningfully hit us, say, off the U.S. West Coast. And that was one where people might differ on that point, and I'm kind of worried about it, but it did jump out to me. But as I said, overall, I thought this, I really appreciate this being done. As Captain Fennell said, it's about time that somebody does this with the open source, sort of get these ideas out to the public. I hope there's obviously a tendency to draw some different conclusions. Everyone will see, a lot of people will see in it what they want to see, either that we win or we lose, or and therefore we should do nothing, or we should win and since we'll win by having a few more things left at the end of the day, we don't need to do anything more, and that's always a challenge. But it does provide, really, I thought was very useful for helping people think about what they think, and also just, say, having the and the willingness to make this so public, hold it open for challenge as well was very good. So I appreciate the opportunity to actually have one of the participants here, learn from them. But thank you.
Thank you, Colonel. It's great to have you with us, and your insights are extraordinarily important, and I know we'll hit them on the question round as well. Next, we're going to turn to yet another 06, Colonel John Mills, United States Army, retired. He has unfortunately been unable to join us in person, but he was kind enough to give us a video that I think is particularly helpful, Colonel Cancian, because, among other things, John has spent a considerable amount of time in the theater working these problems with the Taiwanese, among others. He's been on point for our Committee on the Present Danger China in terms of mapping out kind of a checklist of the things that we should be doing, and I think he's going to speak to some of those that might or might not duplicate what you all have put forward, but I think would represent a further important enrichment of this conversation. So with that, John, in addition to his time in uniform, also served at senior levels in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, spent time at the National Security Council, the Department of Homeland Security. He's a utility infielder, very knowledgeable about the ways of the military as well as the civilian policymaking business, and his insights are also very appreciated. Let's go to the videotape. Colonel Mills.
Frank, members of the committee, colleagues, and viewers, thank you and welcome to our webinar. This is Colonel Retired John Mills. I'd like to spend a few moments going over rapidly developing events in the Western Pacific and indicators of a greatly accelerated timetable for any move by China on Taiwan. So very concerning. There are some positive things that have happened, but there are also a lot of things that are lagging and must be done if we have any hope of deterring a Chinese move, and if it happens, being able to decisively defeat it. So let's go through some of the positive things first. First, Taiwan has increased their defense spending significantly. That's a good thing, and has been a reasonable point for years. But many of the policymakers in the DC area have also said because of the lower level of spending, they're spending too much on what are called prestige weapons, tanks, submarines, things like that. Whereas my personal argument has always been they actually need these visible, demonstrative capabilities to deter. But they also do need to increase in defense spending and spend a lot more on these asymmetric capabilities. So they need more spending so they can spend both on prestige and these asymmetric capabilities. It's been a recommendation of the committee for essentially well over a year, and so it looks like this has happened. Taiwan has significantly increased their budget. They also just announced their conscripts will now serve a complete year, so this greatly increases the manpower staffing levels of the Taiwan military services. So this is a good thing. It shows preparedness and readiness on a much greater scale. So these are good things. The CHIPS Act and actions by the Biden administration in October. The Biden administration took very aggressive action against China in October, which really shocked China. And really the Biden administration wanted to cut off China from chips, and very puzzling when, as we all know, sometimes the administration doesn't seem to be all there. Some elements of the administration are playing bought off and part of the opposition. And we're meeting the Chinese Communist Party. Grave concern that this was a very good action, but years late. This is one of the things Trump and Dr. Navarro wanted to do, but they received, as we all know, so much opposition in the swamp. So good thing, it's late, it asphyxiates China. It essentially is the modern equivalent of when Roosevelt cut off Japan from oil and rubber in Malaya in June of 1941, which Japan had no choice at that time. It triggered the countdown to Pearl Harbor. Japan was frankly had to have that oil and rubber. They had no other choice. So good thing on cutting off chips. Years late, it asphyxiates China, accelerates the timetable of conflict, which is going to happen anyway, most likely, unless we move with alacrity to deter this. The NDAA that was buried in the ginormous omnibus bill, the fiscal year 2023 National Defense Authorization, was excellent, full of many good things for Taiwan and the U.S. military, but we have to move with alacrity. But the good things, greatly increased levels of spending across, and especially focused on the Pacific, with greatly increased storage, buildup of ordnance stocks, which we have been recommending for 2 years. So those are all good things. It essentially establishes a lend-lease program, a World War II America to Britain lend-lease-like program. So this is another punch in the face to the Chinese Communist Party, because we are essentially saying we will defend Taiwan. It's very strong support for a new law buried in the NDAA. It's the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act, odd sounding name, but it's a good act. And again, that lend-lease program is $2 billion per year on top of everything else that Taiwan is asking for, and they could pay us back in 10 to 15 years if we remember it. So these are good things. Also, the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, it grows to about 6.1, 6.2 billion. It should be a lot more. This is spending money for the Indo-Pacific Commander to harden and provide resilience and preparation. Those are good things, but let's go through. Those are all positive things, but we need to let's look at what's the reality of the accelerated timetable. First is related to the PDI and the whole military operation, whole government operation to defend Taiwan, is defense of Guam. Guam is not the fortified rock that some people make it out to be. We need air defense. We really don't have ground-based missiles like Patriot. We need Patriot batteries there now. We should have robust Stinger teams. We need to harden and disperse the airfield. Anderson, these Department of Defense public affairs photos of the B-52s, B-2s, B-1s, tankers lined up nice and neat, so a single pass by a J-29 in a strafing run will put all of our bombers out of commission. Is silly, and we've got to harden and disperse. And this is a hard concept for many American uniformed military commanders to understand. We don't harden and disperse. We've always presumed that we will operate from safe base enclaves. That cannot be presumed. So we need to harden Guam, hardened aircraft shelters, missile defense, air defense, actual coastal missiles so that they can shoot out and deter ships from approaching, because they know we have coast-based missiles that can reach out and touch them. We don't have any of those, so we need to do this rapidly. We have to accelerate these plans. They can't happen 3-5 years down the road. They need to happen in the next 6 months to a year. And we need to do this for the whole second island chain. This includes Tinian, Saipan above Guam, includes Palau, where we're building a massive radar facility. Includes, we need to reactivate Ulithi, the grand harbor at Ulithi in the Federated States of Micronesia. We need to just harden, disperse, prepare the entire second island chain. The Navy shipbuilding, let me talk briefly about Navy shipbuilding. Navy shipbuilding at this point is too important to be left to the Navy. The Navy has been totally unable to recapitalize and expand the 4 public yards and the 6 or so private yards. This is a crisis. And I made a suggestion in the Epoch Times article a couple of months ago, and I was actually very serious about this. We need to give Navy shipbuilding to the Army. We need a modern Leslie Groves, who ran the Manhattan Project, an Army general, to take over, because the Navy, and I know the Navy well, even though I'm an Army guy, and the Navy has been disastrous on their shipbuilding capabilities and repair capabilities for 15 years. I've just watched the Navy staff. I know a number of the personalities. I know them personally. I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on. I think this literally should be taken away from Navy, given to the Army, so we have an Army engineer general to run this and bring our shipbuilding up to the year 2023. It's in a pathetic state. But other quick items here, we need to harden what's going on in Luzon, the northern Philippines, this mysterious airship that's been floating over the Philippines, because the Philippines has no capability to enforce air sovereignty. So we need to harden, we have to have a partnership with the Philippines, harden North Luzon to deter any attempt at a Chinese landing. We need to work closely with Japan and South Korea. Again, in December, China demonstrated very aggressive naval and air action, and continue to this day, against Taiwan and Japan, and new capabilities such as a fleet of float-on, float-off vessels, which are very helpful in any kind of forced amphibious landing. And then the Chinese carriers showed panache as they blew through the southern Japanese islands below Kyushu, which was legally okay, but then they conducted aggressive air operations, and then, without warning, the Liaoning broke and made a dash for Guam in an extraordinary move. And again, we can't presume Guam is ready, and just even a few aircraft. Some of our naval experts would poo-poo the Liaoning's capability, but even a few of those fighter aircraft appearing over Guam could cause absolute disaster and mayhem. So we are on an accelerated timetable to conflict. Some good things, but we have to move much faster if we have any hope of deterring and then, if necessary, defeating the Chinese. There was a very positive report just listed by CSIS, which declared Taiwan would win in almost all scenarios, but it would be extraordinarily costly and bloody to America, Japan, Taiwan, and even more so to China. But the more we repair, the less we will bleed in any potential conflict. Thank you.
Colonel Mills, thank you. And a very elegant way to make the point that we at the committee and I think the authors at CSIS have come to, which is that enhancing deterrence has to be job one, and applying the resources, including those that you've laid out, I think is a part of that. And we'll talk more about how we put all this together and get it done, more to the point. Finally, we're going to hear from one of the most brilliant academics I've had the privilege of knowing, particularly informed about China, but knowledgeable really about international affairs and history in extraordinary detail. Again, no stranger to these programs, another member of our Committee on the Present Danger China, and in fact, the director of the Center for Security Policy's China Policy Program. His name is Dr. Bradley Thayer. He churns out fabulous essays in all the right places with such frequency that I've come to the conclusion that he writes faster than I can read, which is a bit of a handicap when I'm trying to stay abreast of his insights. He's also the author of several important books, the most recent of which he co-authored with Lian Chao Han, another committee member, entitled Understanding the China Threat. We're very anxious to have his thoughts on these war games and other insights as to the way forward. Dr. Thayer, welcome back. Over to you, sir.
Thank you for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to join you as well as my colleagues today to discuss this extremely important study. Mark and his colleagues are to be commended for the work that they've done. It's simply an extraordinary analysis of the risks and variations, of course, and outcomes that the United States is going to incur, as well as, of course, the states of East Asia, China, of course, and our allies there. So it's extremely important for the reasons that Mark identified at the outset of the conversation. I would simply add, too, because of the attention, as Jim observed, but also the attention that's getting within the United States as part of an effort, a very important contribution to shifting or turning the rudder on understanding, of course, the China threat and the way that we have allowed this issue to lapse for so long, and our capabilities, deterrent capabilities, in particular, that we've allowed to lapse for so long. I would simply like to make two major points, and these are really points that serve as nodes, perhaps, that allow us to think through additional implications of the study and issues that we may address in the future. The first of which is deterrence. So when we consider deterrence, of course, we're talking about capabilities that we need to have. Those capabilities are conventional capabilities, which the study does, again, an exceptional job. And Jim has touched on those, as well as Grant and John Mills as well, to a large degree. Conventional capabilities, but also nuclear capabilities. that we need to have, and that would be at the tactical level, a theater level, and at the strategic level. And linked to that, or twin to it, would be missile defense capabilities, cruise missile capabilities, ballistic missile capabilities, and hypersonic, essentially defense capabilities that the United States would need to possess in order to have the capabilities to offer either a conventional or a nuclear deterrent to this outcome. Secondly, there are also political variables that, of course, are going to be involved. So deterrence is a function of the politics as well as capabilities of any state that seeks to deter. So the political variables that are relevant are willpower and the ability to convey willpower. Secondly, credibility, which is closely associated with willpower, and then the balance of resolve. So my first point is to just really look at the political variables in this scenario, which the study, of course, is largely assuming, given the nature of what it's addressing. My points here are first, the balance of resolve. Even though this is an extended deterrence of a Chinese attack against Taiwan is an extended deterrence issue for the United States, we should not assume that the balance of resolve favors China, given the difficult relationship, of course, and the history between Taiwan and China. That is the long history, and that only really recently and relatively briefly has Chinese political power or polity ruled over Taiwan. So it would be very useful as we move ahead to think through really Taiwan as an independent state, as it has been, of course, historically in the long history of international relations in East Asia. So that's a bit of positive news. The balance of resolve, if the United States has the willpower and the credibility and the capabilities, need not favor China, but indeed could favor the United States. Secondly, the U.S. has to convey willpower, the willingness, and has to be backed by the credibility to deal with a robust conventional and nuclear deterrent in this situation. Grant touched on this in his excellent comments, really thinking through, does Taiwan have the willpower to resist, in this instance, Japan as well, and the United States in conjunctions with other states that need to be associated. So a very important job, responsibility of the Biden administration and the successor administration, given the time frame of the study, will be to ensure that there are hard, credible, concrete capabilities in place, but as well as the diplomatic relationship in place to weave together, if you will, the fabric of conventional and nuclear deterrence over Taiwan. We've got to bring the Indians in. They need to have forces deployed on Taiwan. NATO needs to have forces deployed on Taiwan. The US, Australia, of course, Japan. We should have all US allies present there to ensure, as we did in the Cold War when we were worried about the Soviet threat, that there were strong alliance relationships backed by the fact that NATO and other US allies and partners had woven together a very tight political and military relationship to ensure that we have the most robust deterrent as possible. Second point that I'd really like to touch on with respect to the study is the nuclear deterrent aspect of it. So as we move ahead, of course, we're seeing China has grown quite considerably in its nuclear capabilities, while ours have atrophied largely. We've allowed our triad, our infrastructure to atrophy, and that needs to be absolutely reversed. Do we have the right nuclear capabilities at the theater level, the tactical level, and at the strategic level to ensure that China is going to be absolutely essentially the balance of resolve, as well as the ladder of escalation is going to favor the United States? So the study, I think, as we move ahead, looking at the conventional nuclear interface, the relationship between conventional weapons and nuclear weapons is an important issue, but also the recognition that we do not have the right nuclear force structure in the region at this time, and won't have it realistically by 2026, ensures that we have a major test. So in terms of a relationship between the conventional and nuclear, as a result of our decisions over many decades, we're putting enormous emphasis on our conventional forces to be able to offer this a robust deterrent against China. And it can't simply revolve on conventional forces. We need to ensure that we have the right mix offshore and sea-based elements, as well as based on our ICBM force, bomber forces, as well as by aircraft in the region to deliver nuclear weapons. So that allows us to think creatively, or suggest we should think creatively in terms of having not just, for example, W-76-2s on Ohio boats, but maybe bringing B-61s, given that the arsenal or the cupboard is rather bare when it comes to the tactical capabilities. So in conclusion, and on a whole, the study is outstanding. I think the focus on the political is absolutely necessary as we move ahead to underscore what Grant has anticipated, as well as other colleagues, but also, secondly, to recognize the nuclear is equally important to the conventional, because this conflict obviously runs enormous risks of escalating if deterrents were to fail and the Chinese were to attack Taiwan. But again, all participants are to be commended. And I greatly enjoyed the comments of my fellow panelists, as well as Mark's comments and his reflections on the study at the outset. Thank you very much indeed, Frank. A pleasure to join you today.
Thank you, Brad, as always. Important contributions. We'll open up for questions and maybe some give and take if the panelists will accommodate that. And also, I would propose that we go to the bottom of the hour if everybody's schedule can. If you can't stick around, scoot, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to extend this a little bit, because we've set a very rich table, and it's important that we see what we can do to explore a bit further what's been presented. Mark, let me just say, I think you've heard from each of our panelists accolades for the work done here and the way it has been done. I share those sentiments very strongly, and especially, as Jim Fennell pointed out, the fact that I guess for the first time, unbelievably, there is really this body of work now in the unclassified domain at a time when we certainly need to examine this carefully. My principal concern had been that it might, despite your strong admonition that we need to enhance deterrence, it may nonetheless encourage a bit of undue complacency. And one piece of that might be, and it may have been outside of your remit here, but we may not have till 2026. My own personal sense of this is that Xi Jinping sees in Joe Biden in the White House someone that he would rather have as his opponent than whoever might be sitting in the Oval Office in 2026. And one of the things that the committee has been fulminating a lot about, and I'd be interested in your response to this, is that we may in fact have no warning of when the balloon is going to go up here. But a question that members of our audience and others, including may have, is are you confident that when China attacks in many of your scenarios, American assets, carrier battle groups, for example, American personnel, obviously, but also American territory, and it may not just be Guam, where those military installations in Japan and so on, that the mainland would in fact be off limits for countervailing strikes that might help with the issue that Jim talked about fighting from inside the defensive bubble.
Thank you all for those comments. Very interesting. People have raised a lot of interesting questions. Let me answer a couple of them. And I know we've got a bunch in the in the chat also. On this question about strikes on the mainland, we went around about this. First about whether the U.S. president would authorize U.S. strikes against the Chinese mainland. In the base case, we find it cited yes, that the president would, but we ran some excursions where those strikes were not authorized because there's a lot of debate about what might actually happen. The Chinese were allowed to strike the U.S. They always struck Guam. They could strike the West Coast or Hawaii if they wanted to, but basically, I mean, it was just hard to do and not worthwhile. They have their hands full in the Western Pacific and can't really divert a lot of military capability elsewhere. I mean, you can argue about, if there were a strike on the West Coast, would that cause such a panic that it would have strategic effects? I mean, you can make that argument. It's not unreasonable. We didn't play that. People have raised questions about nuclear. Those are excellent questions. We hope to do a follow-on that looks at nuclear operations. We excluded it here just because those, that takes the game off in an entirely different direction, and for reasons of time and funding, frankly, we focused it on conventional. But nuclear is a very reasonable question. Another one that I've seen in the chat is, do you really think that this is the most likely future event? And the answer is no, we don't. We think that if I had to bet, most people would say a blockade is probably a more likely Chinese approach. But what we do say is that the Chinese rhetoric explicitly includes the possibility of invasion. That rhetoric is becoming increasingly aggressive, and this would be the most dangerous course of action, and that's why we looked at it. A couple of other things. Let's see. Warning. Question of warning came up. Again, a great question. Some people argue that there would be very long warning. We have lots of time to see what the Chinese were up to. Other people make the argument that, of course, warning would be very short. Particularly, I think part of that argument is that we might see what they're doing. We just wouldn't believe that that a war was imminent. Like in Ukraine, the United States came to believe that war was coming. The Ukrainians didn't. They didn't mobilize until after the war began because they just couldn't believe this was going to happen. So it's certainly possible that we would see all of this and not take action. For our base case, we had the intermediate assumption of Chinese mobilized for 30 days. We started after 15. We did look at a sort of a 0-day U.S. Mobilization that sets back the flow of reinforcements. It's not fatal, but it increases costs. We also looked at what happened if the United States did not play at all. Someone asked the question, well, what happens if the United States doesn't intervene? And we played that Taiwan alone, we called it. And the Taiwanese could actually hold on for 2 to 3 months. Ultimately, they're overwhelmed. The Chinese are just have too much combat power. But the island, I think I mentioned, it's very easy to defend. And if the Taiwanese really put their minds to it, they can hold out, I say, 2 or 3 months. The question about the Taiwanese came up again, an excellent question. Would they fight? And that's why we highlighted that as our number one assumption. We are assuming that the Taiwanese fight. You see a lot of debate about, would they fight? Would they fight effectively? And there's really no way to know that ahead of time. I say we assume that they would. Based partly on the experience with Ukraine, but we recognize, just how uncertain it is. Some countries have folded, when attacked. So, let me look at a couple of other things here, and then we can open it up to some of the questions that are coming in the chat. I've seen many of those. Question came up about, I think, about People's War, and we did include a lot of civilian ships and decoys, which was, at least a piece of, a total Chinese economic mobilization. So those are mixed in with the amphibious ships. So when you shoot missiles at the Chinese amphibious fleet, half the time you're hitting decoys. And then finally, the question about a two-front war came up. Again, a great question. We had a number of scenarios where the U.S. was distracted by something going on in the Middle East or in Europe. So the flow of reinforcements is much slower. Again, eventually the United States prevails, but the cost is higher. We did not look at a simultaneous North Korea and Taiwan conflict, which is perfectly valid, but we didn't look at that in part because we just had the tools to look at the one set of scenarios. But that would be an interesting and very demanding set of very demanding scenario. So let me stop there, and if I've missed any important questions from the panelists, I'm happy to handle those, or happy to handle them from the chat.
Well, let me moderate, if I may, this Q&A. Jim Fennell, you feel free to put a question if you'd like, but one thing that I would like to ask you to address in particular, because everybody is basically talking about the need for a further effort to have a ramp up of the forces, the assets, the equipment, the ships, the aircraft, and so on, to wage war against the Chinese in this circumstance, or more importantly, immediately deter it. Speak to the industrial base of this country. John Mills put a finger in your eye probably about shipbuilding, but where are we in terms of the capacity, especially with Ukraine having depleted our kit to some extent to meet these needs?
I think the issue of our ability to be able to mobilize ourselves, at least the U.S. side, and certainly to be able to prop up Taiwan with the supplies that the study says needs to get there before any shooting started, we're being hard pressed across the board. And so one of my concerns is, and why I applaud the study, because it raises this issue, however unlikely some may feel the idea of a full-scale invasion is, the idea that for the last 20 years we've seen the PRC mobilization, military modernization, and their own mobilization in many ways, and yet it hasn't changed the dynamic significantly in DC. So we were talking about this Pacific Defense Initiative that's in the NDAA, 4.5 billion, maybe up to 6.1 billion. How does that compare with the 100 billion that we've just given to Ukraine? So for a fight that's going to be much more demanding, and so we're not ready. The Navy in and of itself has tried to, at least in the submarine community, expand the submarine production. If you go back 5 years ago, we were producing one SSN, fast attack nuclear submarine, and one ballistic missile submarine once every year. We're trying to double the SSNs. We're even looking at ways to go to 3. I'm not sure we're there yet. In terms of ship production, John's criticism of what we've done as a Navy is correct, but I don't think the answer is to give it to the Army. I think the answer is that it's a matter of what Brad talked about, national will. It's a matter of where's the Carl Vinson of 2023 inside the U.S. Congress that's going to get us to mobilize our nation to build these things. And I know that they won't be there maybe by 2026, but there's a whole lot of things beyond the ships that this study accurately points out that need to be procured, developed, procured, and built and fielded. And we could do that if we have a national agenda. And so it's really a matter of national will. And so I'll just close with, you all know on the Committee on Present Danger, I've talked and written about the decade of concern, and you referenced, Frank, time. And that's been my thesis, is China is not playing this long game. China and the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, are on a timeline, and their timeline is in this decade of concern. And so that the fact that the study, without quoting me, without referencing my works, did come out and say, we're analyzing an invasion in 2026. So for me, that was a confirmation that despite pushback from all sectors over the last decade, that it's seeped through. But I'm worried that it's not going to get outside of this milieu of academic conversation, and it's not going to get into a guy like Mike Gallagher, and it's not going to get into the congressional districts where people really realize that if this doesn't happen, their life may change in America.
Let me get one more question in for Colonel Newsom. If Colonel Mills were with us, I think he probably would have taken exception to your comment about the fifth column. And when we hear Mark talking about the resolve of the Taiwanese to fight and the possibility that there might be some disruptions or some difficulties with unions or what have you, it doesn't really speak to the possibility that large numbers, I mean, set aside special operations units and the like that are infiltrated in, but there may be large numbers of folks in Taiwan itself, as things stand now, who would be batting for the other team. And I wondered if you wanted to lay that out in a little bit more detail as to why you're concerned that's a real problem.
A couple of things. First, if you look at Chinese strategy, going back to the Chinese Civil War, it always involved large numbers of, quote, use insurgents for the better word, but getting your people into the places you're going to hit. The invasion of Hainan Island is an excellent case study on that. But I say it's part of the strategy that the Chinese have, is to undercut from inside. And I would suggest actually that if you had besides the political subversion, the turncoats that you've got within the Taiwan military, and it seems like there's no end of them, that those can have a huge effect. Even relatively small number of shooters out and about shooting up bus stops, gas stations, schools, that makes it really hard to concentrate on an incoming attack. And the mention of Kaohsiung port was not something I made up. This used to be, I perhaps know a little bit about what's going on, and it is something that has really got me worried. And I think it's more than just a nuisance, but rather I think it is something that one really has to be careful of. Additionally, moving people and hardware into Taiwan is no problem at all. It never has been. You have regular smuggling routes between the mainland and Formosa and Taiwan that it's almost got a timetable, fast boats moving in. I say it's not at all hard to do, but 50, 60 years of subversion to set up a sort of a target, and with easy access, that is something that I think needs to be taken more very seriously. And that is, it's not just a nuisance, but rather potentially something that has a decisive effect on the fight. And then, as I said, that as part of this, it's not just shooting up, say, a bus stop or a school, but rather the political warfare where Taiwanese academia is so heavily subverted. You have in the business class as well, in the political world as well. The political warfare, the influencing, the subversion has been immense over a long time. And this, once again, affects the will to resist. And unfortunately, I don't think the Taiwanese are the Finns. And plus, you combine that with 40 years of isolation and the operational effect that has had on Taiwanese military capabilities, but really the psychological effect that has had on the Taiwanese public. This too is part of the fifth column that I'm talking about. But it is, I think, a very serious thing, and that would be my take on it.
Thank you, Colonel. Brad, you've studied this matter closely. There is a question that I think is recurring in the chat among other places, and that is, what obligation do we have to defend Taiwan? Strategic ambiguity has, of course, been the express policy of the United States government, notwithstanding Biden's intermittent assertions that we would defend Taiwan. But as you've studied in your new book, Understanding the China Threat, you talk about Xi Jinping as a risk taker. And especially in the context of the kind of internal difficulties his government is facing at the moment, as we've discussed on these programs and elsewhere, social engineering may be an impetus for him to seize Taiwan, or try to at the very least, with everything else that goes with it. But talk a little bit about this from the point of view of Xi's calculations about Biden. The elite capture that Grant just talked about is certainly true here as well as in Taiwan and much else of the world. How do you reckon he sees it? And is your guess that he's more inclined to go for it at this point, maybe well before 2026, and go for it in some of the worst ways we've been discussing?
Well, Frank, that's an excellent question, an extremely important one. I agree wholeheartedly with Jim Fennell that the timeline is very likely much shorter than even this excellent war game anticipates, 2026. It could be tomorrow, it could be next week, it could be in a month. And why is that the case? That's the case really for three reasons. First, Xi Jinping, as you identified, Frank, here we have an individual who sees himself as greater than Mao and is determined to affect an imprint on the party, as well as, of course, on China and its position in the world, as he himself has proclaimed. He's an individual also who's risk accepting, and so we should anticipate that his actions are not going to be like his predecessors. Secondly, the ideology of the Communist Party under Xi, but also previously, Xi is, in terms of his ideological goals, and the party strongly supports this, underscored at the 20th Party Congress, where Xi referenced this explicitly, that conquering Taiwan, or unifying Taiwan, as he would put it, is a key goal of the Chinese Communist Party. And then thirdly, deeply, the balance of power. The relative balance of power has changed in China's favor, given their prodigious growth of conventional and nuclear capabilities, which gives Taiwan the capabilities now to blockade or to conquer Taiwan that they did not have, obviously, in the previous Taiwan Straits crises of the 1950s or 1995, 1996 today. Therefore, for deterrence to obtain, given that threat, again, we have an individual, deterrence is about the political considerations. His willpower, his intent are high, his capabilities are growing. That has to be matched on our side. And sadly, because we've been living off of the capital of the Cold War, we're not in the position that we should be to deal with it. So to have that robust extended deterrent, we need to make Taiwan the 51st state of the United States. We need to be willing to make that commitment. We need to be willing to forge an alliance relationship that brings in NATO, that brings in India. We need to have capabilities that we're hard pressed, but nonetheless, we need to rush. That would be, we had designed the follow-on to the Lance at the end of the Cold War to have mobile systems that would be able to deal with this threat. So when we're looking at it from China's point of view, Frank, we can see that the intent to conquer Taiwan is high and their capabilities are expanding. And does he see a window of opportunity because of the Biden administration and calculated ambiguity, which has been a U.S. policy? And my response to that is we have to get rid of that calculated capability. We need to ensure that the political calculus is quite clear. We will fight over Taiwan, and that's going to require education. As I observed, the Biden administration has to explain why Taiwan is significant to America's national security, and to do that in an unambiguous fashion. And there is not, sadly, there's, despite the, if you will, the vacillation that you mentioned, we simply don't have that yet.
Thank you, Brad. Mark Kansian, let me give you the last word. Comments on what we've just said and anything else that you'd like to make sure is on our record as we wrap this up.
Well, I appreciate all the comments. There's lots to discuss. As I mentioned, there's a lot of other work that needs to be done, about blockades, about nuclear, the whole economic aspect of any conflict. I think I would wrap up by making one sort of global point, which is we've focused on a conflict in the Western Pacific, what it would take to deter China or defeat China if it tried to conquer Taiwan. But I would emphasize that that's not the sum total of U.S. National security commitments. I hear some people saying, well, we should essentially leave the rest of the world to other people and just focus on China because that's the pacing thread. But I don't think a superpower can do that. I think we have interests in Europe, we have interests in the Middle East, and we're going to need forces for those also. Sometimes those are different forces. Questions about aircraft carriers come up, for example. They're very vulnerable if too close to China, hugely helpful in other parts of the world. So my recommendation as people think about this is remember that we need to deter and then, if necessary, defeat China. We also have global interests and we need to maintain forces for those also. And that costs a lot of money.
Amen to that, especially at a time when budget is not all that it needs to be, and what there is of it is being hollowed out by inflation. Let me just offer a concluding thought or two of my own, if I may. Again, my deep appreciation. I would just say, Mark, that in addition to other parts of the world that we have to be concerned about beyond Asia, of course, Africa and Latin America, most especially, are very much in play, in part thanks to what the Chinese Communist Party has been doing to colonize nations throughout those regions as well as elsewhere around the world. It's a stunning fact that at the last count I saw, something on the order of 147 of the world's 196 or so states are now part of this Belt and Road Initiative to one degree or another, with strategic implications, again, to one degree or another, meaning that in the event the balloon does go up, if we have not taken the steps necessary to deter China, if we've not done so, not just in the space of capabilities, but in the space of political, palpable, tangible, unquestionable resolve, that we may well find ourselves not only in a very messy and costly fight in East Asia, but also globally, quite possibly. I think the points that have been made about Chinese calculations and the prospect that this might happen very, very quickly with little or no notice is something that I hope, Mark, in your future work you will be exploring as well. It's daunting enough, I'm sure, to have set the goalposts out 4 years or so, let alone next week. But to the extent that we especially have to counter the complacency that comes from being told we think we've got this, at least under certain scenarios, it is important that we brace up those who will be in positions to make decisions about actual steps taken to enhance deterrence and to convey resolve, which is critical, of course, to the physical deterrence, are properly apprised of just how imminent this could possibly be. So I want to thank all of our speakers, Mark Kansian, most especially representing his son Matthew, and Eric Higginbotham, and Captain James Fennell, Colonel Grant Newsom, Colonel John Mills, and of course Dr. Bradley Thayer for important insights into the war that is possibly upon us, and certainly no drill if it is, as well as the analysis that has flowed from this very important effort, sponsored, as you mentioned, Mark, by our friends at the Smith Richardson Foundation. So thank you to them, as well as to you and your team at CSIS. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this webinar. We will look forward to talking with you again next week. And until then, I'm going to turn this all over once again to our colleague and Executive Secretary of the Committee on the Present Danger China, Didi Laugesen.
Thank you, Frank. And thanks to all of you, as Frank said, for being here today. A video of this webinar will post to presentdangerchina.org within a day or two of the end of our program. It's generally up by late night, the day of the program. So check back at presentdangerchina.org. Please share this and our other programs with your officials and representatives, colleagues, and other networks. Join us again next week for our next installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how the U.S. is betrayed by CCP-captured elites. Thanks for joining us today, and goodbye.